Don't come near me, Mark. Take your money and leave. My sister Claire snapped, the words like a slap that echoed through the realtor's hall. And people at the long table glanced up from coffee cups and dessert plates, whispering, smirking, a cousin's fork clinking. My daughter Emma's cheeks folding in on herself because she had hoped I'd stay for the part where family came together. And somewhere behind Claire, Mom's eyes went hard and distant like a winter road disappearing into fog. My name is Mark Turner. I'm 42 and I'm from Akron, Ohio, and I said it once to myself the way a man counts off a lifeline because names are ballast and the room was tilting. I let the sentence fall, and then I watched Claire lace her words into the narrative she wanted while I held, in the hollow of my palm, a detail they could not imagine. There's a clause I tucked under paper and digital ink, a small hinge that opens things, and it has been waiting. People were reacting with the slow cruelty of a bar that recognizes an accident and pretends it's a joke. An aunt I barely knew murmured, awkward, as if that could arm her, as if that could keep the heat off. The humiliation landed first, because she said it in front of Emma, because she wanted me gone where my daughter might see I was powerless, and because I had built my life to protect that girl from this exact two-faced season. Claire's dress had a pocket of lace at the hip that caught candlelight and made her look like a bride before the vows, which made it worse. She smiled at her fiancé, Ethan Brooks, the man my sister was about to marry, who read the room like a man who'd just passed a test relief on his face, while my receipts and my ledgers, the blue mason jar on my garage shelf with the words, "Keep for a rainy day," written in my mother's old handwriting, buzzed against the inside of my skull like a beehive I meant to open later. The blue jar is a stupid domestic thing, but it's also a map. I started putting envelopes in it years ago, little packets of proof, vendor receipts, text messages, the Venmo notes that said, "For Claire's wedding, do not tell." A check stub with her signature, a photo of a contract with my name in the margins. All of it a quiet collection nobody asked to see until the night they did. The room smelled of coffee and the fake perfume people use to say they are important. I felt my pulse in the hollow between heart and throat, and, memory quick as breath, I saw every time I had driven to Claire's apartment hauling furniture in the rain, how I had refused to take a thank you that felt like a prior notice of indebtedness. "Take your money," she said, and there was a small chorus of callers straightening, of people angling away from the stain of shame. Someone laughed softly, not the right kind of sound. I stood, glass cold and sweating in my hand, and I let the chair scrape like an accusation on wood. I had the receipts. I had the text messages. I had the quiet clause. And I had Emma looking at me like she had lost a bet on who I was. The wedding planner, Maya Collins, hovered in the doorway with a clipboard and the expression of someone who organizes chaos for a living and was used to the theatrics of love. She smelled of perfume and rubber bands and said nothing because wedding planners are trained to be invisible until the end. I could have argued, could have shouted contracts and numbers and the domestic math of a man who pays, but the first move of revenge is always a measured silence. You let the other side reveal themselves by moving first, and they leapt at the silence like animals on a carcass. They told stories about me at the table in the same breath they ate, turning my decades of quiet support into a currency they could cash in public by pretending it counted for nothing. "We're keeping it small," Claire said, and the room exhaled relief that they had chosen the script where exclusions are the price of intimacy. My hand went to the blue jar in a pocket memory where I stored the tactile thing. The jar had been my mother's, chipped at the rim, stained with jam. I'd used it to hold receipts because you put tangible things in tangible places when you want them to be real. The humiliation was sharp enough that it made me small in my own eyes for a second, and then the second after I felt something colder, a plan uncoiling in me like a cable. I remembered the exact words of a text Claire once sent me, thanking me for covering the band, the flowers, the deposit for the church, and the addendum she typed later, "I'll invite you to the rehearsal dinner," and then she had left it there. A casual note that read like a promise until the night someone decided to burn the words and still eat the cake. People in that room had voted with their eyes to believe the version of family that excluded me. Emma's small hand found mine under the table and tightened like a lifeline, as if she could rescue me with 2 fingers. The first strike of revenge was not legal. It was positional. I left them to their glow of candles and cameras and went to the Mustang in the parking lot while rain began to make the pavement mirror the fairy lights. And I drove with radio static to the lawyer I'd met once for something mundane and useful. A man named Tony Alvarez, who smelled like linoleum, and organized a law practice the way a coach organizes players, and I outlined, calmly, a heartless set of steps that fit into the clause I had tucked away: conditional repayment, promissory language, and a way to make an omission look like a breach. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I wrote that sentence like a splinter into the quiet moment when I sat at my kitchen table that night, the television aglow in the other room showing a late-night host joking about family feuds, because even silence needs an audience and because the world runs on watchers. After I typed it into an email draft to a friend, I looked at the blue jar on the shelf across from the microwave and felt the weight of things I'd saved. Claire made me a villain in front of my daughter, but she had no idea that her comfortable script had a footnote I could use. I swallowed coffee that tasted like old paper and mapped out contingencies and bullet points because a revenge that lacks paperwork is a pantomime and not a last act. I would not crash the wedding with an accusation. I would do something colder, a withdrawal of the unspoken subsidy, then a legal nudge until their comfortable table chair faces the invoice. I thought of the road trip nights when Claire had been high school wild, and I'd have been the one to bail her out of trouble, and how she had told me once, laughing, that she'd pay me back when she was famous. The laugh turned inside me and became a file. At a bar 2 nights later, Tony and I sat under a neon sign and made the bones of a plan. Transfer of funds documented, conditional forgiveness clause suddenly relevant, and the handiest thing of all. Claire had never squeezed an official signature onto a particular post-it agreement she'd asked me to sign years ago when I wired the first of many deposits. She had signed in a different place. The technicality would hum like an engine when we pushed the right button. I felt a cheap thrill at the lacework of it. Revenge is a craft, and I was learning the grain. My life had been made of small, steady gestures. Covering a rent with a check, driving across states to help fix a leaky roof, sitting in court at a custody hearing as if a supportive presence could be armor, and now the same steadiness would be weaponized. A martyred thought flickered. You can be broke and generous, but you can't be generous and erased, which I repeated to myself like a spell, because every man needs a line he can hold when the night presses in. The plan required patience and a sense of theater. It required the blue jar and a social hammer, screenshots, the right-leaked chat, a viral post that would sting like salt. I would not let Emma see the ugliness. I would be a ghost figure in her day-to-day present but not performing. I would let the legalities speak. And so I rehearsed in my head how to convert kindness into leverage without revenge, becoming something that destroyed me as well. The first night I took a drive alone through the edge of town where trucks throw their headlights through wet fields. I held the blue jar and turned the receipts like a book of small betrayals. Invoices for the caterer, the band, flights, and invoice from the florist with my name in the memo field. Each one was a quiet arrow. I started to compose messages that would feel casual to a stranger but cataclysmic to those in my family. A single screenshot to a cousin, an offhand message to a family group that said, "Remember when we all agreed family meant something?" And then nothing until the ripples began. The second section must pick this up where it leaves off, and I moved on with the plan tightening in my chest like a fist, a thing you can feel without seeing. And so I drove back into town, the Mustang's heater, a small miracle, and began to put the pieces in place as if I were assembling a camera that would expose them in the harshest light. The stitches of what I was about to do were technical, intimate, and public, and the taste of it was metallic with resolve, and I realized I had become a man who knew the value of every receipt. Justice, I thought, is sometimes the slow reading aloud of the ledger. So I set the blue jar on the kitchen table like a detonator and began the work of turning memory into evidence. I opened envelopes, flattened yellowing receipts beneath the lamp, photographed faded checks and deposit slips, and watched the metadata stamp itself into permanence on my phone. Times, locations, the little GPS breadcrumb that says where you were when you were being generous. I uploaded PDFs to a secure folder at Tony's office while the storm outside threw windshield wipers like metronomes, and the house smelled of coffee gone cold. Tony insisted on formal language, a demand letter that read less like a temper and more like a subpoena, and we drafted a short surgical sentence that would force the vendors to pick sides. Per the documented deposits and the attached vendor invoices, immediate reconciliation of services must be addressed, or the undersigned will pursue statutory remedies including lien and recovery. I could feel the sentence in my throat like a bullet. Tony taught me to keep sentences crisp and to avoid moralizing. A judge doesn't take pity on a sentimental ledger. I scanned the Venmo notes that said, "For Claire's band, Mark," and a text timestamp where Claire herself typed, "Don't worry, I'll sort the guest list with you," and froze them with restraint, because the digital thing is a ruthless witness. Messages do not look like people. They look like evidence. I texted my cousin, Paul, with a cropped screenshot of Claire's "I'll sort the guest list" text and a short caption. "Does this sound like someone who told me to stay away?" Paul replied in 2 emoji-laced sentences and then dropped it into the family group chat with no preface, and the chat blew up like a hornet nest. The first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then the rewriting of the narrative. If Claire had told me to leave, why would she promise to include me earlier? Screenshots travel in gusts. A cousin posts and strangers weigh in. A neighbor who runs a suburban Facebook page shared the screenshot to a community group with 60,000 followers, and the slow trickle of commentary became a flood. I watched the post climb in hits while I sat on the hood of the Mustang outside a 24-hour diner, coffee bitter and steaming in a styrofoam cup, and felt a strange mix of triumph and sick nausea. Public humiliation is a coin that pays both ways. Within hours, a recording from a rehearsal vendor accidentally uploaded to a cloud account and contained a voicemail where Claire thanked me for arranging a deposit. Tony highlighted that recording in an email to the venue, which then froze further payouts pending clarification. Vendors are accountable to contracts and bank transfers, and once Tony showed the signed receipts and chain of payments, the venue couldn't in good conscience ignore the paper trail. A vendor manager named Steve called Claire and read us the clause they'd overlooked. A signed vendor contract required an organizer to acknowledge third-party payers in writing within 10 days of payment to avoid refund disputes. Claire had never done it. That small oversight, a signature in the wrong box, a checkbox left unticked on an online form, is the sort of human slip that looks like a technicality and tastes like defeat. I watched them frantically comb through vendor inboxes trying to find their paperwork like men rummaging for life belts. My phone buzzed constantly with new screenshots, replies, and a cousin's video where a family friend recited names like evidence at a town hall. The video clipped across platforms, and the story turned from private slight to public transaction. People began to ask why the person who paid wasn't on the guest list. Journalists call that narrative friction, a point where an everyday story becomes a thing people want to share. The friction sparked comments that made Claire's cheeks flush red in photos she later posted to appear unaffected. The cruelty in that room had a public price. I didn't want the glitter of it. I wanted the exact arithmetic of fairness, and so I followed Tony's counsel. Legal pressure paired with social pressure is catalytic. I had rehearsed every text I'd ever sent to her. Now they were instruments in an orchestra that played only one note. Emma called me the third day in a whisper that said everything. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice broke like thin glass, and I told her I was fine because I'm a man who knows how to answer a child without collapsing the picture. She asked if I was going to the wedding, and my silence was a small cruelty. I chose because proof would be the instrument that taught the lesson, not my presence. I began to feel the whiplash. When the post hit, some family members texted support and others cut contact. Aunt Lorraine sent a message that read like a threat. Mom stopped answering my calls for one day and then called back with a voice that was a strained string. In the gym early mornings, hitting the bag until my fists rang inside my palms, I counted off breaths and receipts, and the rhythm of physical pain steadied the sharper, less tangible ache. Humiliation lives in the throat. Rage lives in the hands. At a bar on a Thursday night, under a neon sign advertising local beer, I met with Paul and 2 others who had watched us at family gatherings and hadn't intervened when it mattered. They were quiet allies now, their faces the same as they'd been at Thanksgiving when casserole plates passed like treaties. We'd planned how to nudge the story into view without burning the house down. A calm public post with scanned invoices, a short caption, a request for the community to ask itself what family loyalty looked like. Paul agreed to post it on the neighborhood page and to tag local reporters who had been covering small-town disputes. The post was surgical, not vengeful. It listed facts, provided copies of payments, and invited Claire to account for the discrepancy. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared by strangers who called it unsettling transparency. The whiplash was this. People I'd never met messaged me with condolence and admiration, and my inbox ballooned with invitations to appear on podcasts about toxic family dynamics, which made my skin crawl. I never wanted to be a spectacle. The blue jar sat in my bag like a relic between decisions. Sometimes I pulled it out and thumbed its chipped rim like a medallion, feeling both the domesticity and the detonator. The jar held the receipts and one other thing, a crumpled napkin where Claire had once scrawled, after I paid a deposit, "You're a saint, M." That napkin had a stain of coffee and a low, honest, saw-like note that proved intention, and I kept it like proof that kindness had once been recognized. I zipped a copy of that napkin into a file and attached it to an email with the subject line, "Reconciliation request, immediate attention required." The email went to the venue, the planner Maya, and to a crowd of vendors who were suddenly alert to liability. In legal circles, the strategy Tony and I used is called leveraging creditor pressure. No courtroom fireworks, just a flow of paperwork that makes life inconvenient until someone makes a decision that favors you. Claire replied via text in the middle of the night. "This is spite, Mark." Her message was clipped and childish, and yet it carried the old intimacy of people who had shared a family table. I saved it. I then recorded a short, emotionless voice note, attached the receipts, and sent them to a local blogger who had a reputation for taking family feuds and treating them like civic drama. She asked to run an interview. I said yes because the point of exposing wasn't humiliation for its own sake. It was to stop the erasure of what I had done. The community's reaction was uneven and immediate. Some called for privacy, others for accountability, and in the middle of it, I watched Emma at school being asked by a friend whose father had seen the post whether family fights were normal, and I, who had wanted to protect her from the ugliness, found myself teaching her the currency of truth. Each time the post gained traction, Claire's camp countered with carefully curated photos of her smiling with Ethan, a plastic deflection that tried to make everything look fine. Ethan, who had seemed smug the night he and Claire first shut me out, began to look unsettled in public comments, his replies defensive and short. The more he commented, the worse he looked, like a man who'd learned he was in a play he didn't write. The small victories multiplied. A florist returned an email apologizing for a misfiled invoice, a band demanded confirmation of payment, and the venue sent a tentative hold notice because banks and lawyers liked their boxes checked. Tony wrote a terse letter invoking consumer protection rules and vendor liability. The letter ended with a procedural flourish that made them take their obligations seriously. It was in that moment, with legal pressure emanating like a slow, unstoppable tide and my phone buzzing with screenshots of manager emails, that I realized how fragile social arrangements are when exposed to ordinary paperwork. I had a philosophical beat then, a thought that struck with the clarity of a neon sign. People mistake shame for power until someone shows them the receipt. I said it once in the car to no one, a quotable line that felt less like anger and more like a worn, hard truth, then turned my phone screen away and drove to the rehearsal venue where Claire would be practicing with a band that night, though I wouldn't go inside. I stood under a streetlight and watched her through the rain-darkened window as she argued with someone about centerpieces. And for a moment, I pitied her the way you pity a person about to walk into a trap they don't yet see. The digital exposure had done what I needed. It had shifted the crowd's attention from the private humiliation to an inconvenient truth. But reverberations came in unexpected directions. An old friend called and asked whether I wanted my name attached to the post because public feuds have a way of following people into jobs and opportunities. My phone trembled with messages from a broker asking about my availability for a contract because we like to work with people who stand up. These were strange bouquets. The stress found new outlets. I drank too much one night at a bar and woke with a voicemail from Mom asking me to come over to talk. She said nothing about the receipts. Her voice only asked if I was eating and sleeping. Mom's concern made me softer than the plan required, and I swallowed the softness because I wanted her not to choose sides. The plan required cold patience. I could not let tenderness dismantle the scaffolding I had built. I tightened the screws. Tony filed a notice of claim against the organizer of Claire's ceremony, and our legal team sent a certified letter stating that unless the organizer provided documented evidence of fund acknowledgement, they could be liable for restitution. The organizer, under pressure, asked for mediation, and suddenly there were conference calls I hadn't imagined, vendors reading clauses aloud, a planner named Maya in tears because weddings are reputations and reputations are money. The noose was not a single rope, but a series of small, intersecting cords. bank freezes, vendor holds, social posts, and the slow, patient presentation of receipts. My own life, in parallel, had to continue. Mornings at the office where I managed payroll, nights helping Emma with algebra, the ordinary scaffolding that made me undeniable as a provider. I walked into the office one day and watched a coworker glance at my phone and then up at me with a measured sympathy. Gossip is its own economy. I stayed focused. Every email, every recorded voicemail, every scanned receipt was another stitch. The tension tightened in my chest when Claire posted a photo of Emma at a lunch with the caption "Family First," as if the photo could rewrite months of neglect. Emma texted me a heart and then asked if I'd ever been invited to anything that mattered, and I didn't answer for a long time because the truth was heavy and useful and it needed to be wielded carefully. The plan was not only to expose, but to make them confront the cost of excluding the person who paid. I kept the blue jar under the passenger seat of my car now, its rim chipped and its contents digitized. And when I looked at it late at night, I felt the strange comfort of a man who had turned homely things into leverage, who had learned that brutality can wear the guise of paperwork and still feel like justice, and the tightening of the plan hummed like a radio tuned to a single frequency, building toward something that would require the next move to be precise and irreversible. So I sat in the dark of the driveway and drafted the wording that would set the next stage, the notice that would force their hand. And then I packed the jar and drove toward the rehearsal hall, because the story was about to change again when I confronted the human mechanics of their denial, and the rehearsal hall looked like a cathedral stolen from a dream. Light spilling from tall windows onto slick asphalt. Laughter filtering out in sudden bursts that cut me like glass, and I tightened my grip on the blue jar under the passenger seat, breathing like a man about to cross a battlefield he had already mapped. I didn't walk inside. I waited until the crowd spilled out for air, Claire radiant in borrowed white, Ethan with his hand at the small of her back like possession, my mother trying not to look guilty under the fluorescent glow of street lamps, and I recorded everything in the silence of my phone's camera. The casual way Claire laughed about costs as if money sprouted, the way she told the bridesmaids, "Mark thinks he's owed something just because he pays for things." That sentence would be my weapon. I cropped it into a 12-second clip, Ethan's smirk punctuating it, and I sent it in real time to Tony with the caption, "Leverage." We didn't release it immediately. Strategy is patience disguised as hesitation. I drove away with the jar rattling like a metronome against the seatbelt buckle, and went home to Emma, who was asleep on the couch with textbooks fanned across her chest, unaware of the detonations moving closer. The next morning, Tony called, "We go tomorrow. Demand letter plus social release. You want to press or settle?" I chose both, because revenge is not binary. It is orchestration. We filed the notice of claim formally with the county clerk, invoking contract law, and at the same time, I released a clean screenshot of Claire's message about sorting the guest list into a neighborhood group under my own name. The post read like confession, not accusation. I supported my sister's wedding in every way. This message is why I believed I would be included. I wasn't. The comments ignited like dry grass. Neighbors, old high school classmates, even former colleagues flooded the thread, some angry, some sympathetic, all demanding explanation. I watched Claire scramble in real time, replying under her own account. "This is private family business." But privacy dies once screenshots live. Ethan chimed in with arrogance, dismissing me as bitter, and the thread turned on him, strangers calling out entitlement. "Funny how quick people defend when they're living on someone else's dime," one comment read, racking up hundreds of likes. The humiliation had shifted. It no longer sat on me. It draped itself on them like a heavy coat they couldn't take off. At work that day, I signed invoices with a steady hand while my phone buzzed in my pocket like a heart attack. Coworkers whispered, some supportive, some cautious. My boss, a practical man named Richard, called me into his office and closed the door. "Saw the posts," he said, voice low. "Family's messy. But don't lose your job over proving a point." His warning felt like care and like a test. I promised him I wouldn't falter, and I meant it, because the revenge wasn't rage anymore. It was a ledger balancing itself. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, Emma across from me, and she asked the question that sliced deeper than any legal notice. "Do you still love Aunt Claire?" I stared at her, coffee cooling in my hands, and told her the truth she needed. "I don't love what she's done, but I can't turn off blood." Emma nodded, tears threatening, and I realized revenge is heavier when children watch. Still, I pressed forward. Tony filed motions that froze the venue's payout, forcing Claire to explain missing acknowledgments. The planner, Maya, panicked, emailing me privately, begging me to withdraw, offering partial refunds. I ignored her because justice was not negotiable. The band canceled, the florist demanded repayment, and suddenly Claire's wedding looked less like a celebration and more like a hemorrhage. Ethan raged in texts leaked by Paul. "We'll sue him for harassment." But his threats evaporated when Tony reminded them that our claims were contractual, not personal. Legal technicalities eat arrogance alive. That week, a cousin forwarded me a recording of Claire at a brunch, complaining about me, saying, "He thinks receipts make him family." I listened twice, saved it, then forwarded it to Tony, who laughed once. Short, sharp, and said, "She just admitted to the whole case." We drafted a motion highlighting that recording as acknowledgement of my financial contributions. The noose was closing. Yet even as the pressure mounted, I felt the ache of doubt. At night, the silence was filled with memory. Claire and I as kids trading Halloween candy, laughing until stomachs hurt, promises of loyalty that adulthood corroded. I drank too much whiskey one evening and smashed a glass in the sink, Emma rushing in to ask if I was okay. I told her I was fine. I wasn't, but revenge doesn't wait for grief to subside. The following morning, I packed the blue jar into a leather bag, drove to the courthouse, and handed over notarized copies of every receipt. Paper stacked like bricks. Justice has weight. On my way out, I stopped at the diner for coffee, the waitress glancing at the jar and asking, "Special delivery?" I smiled thinly. "Yeah, long time coming." The jar was my symbol, my relic, my promise, and soon it would become their ruin. Because Tony had scheduled mediation for Friday, and mediation means exposure, and exposure means collapse. And as I sipped bitter coffee under fluorescent lights, I rehearsed the words I'd use when the moment came, words that would land like a hammer. I didn't want poetry, I wanted accuracy. Because in America, fairness is often less about forgiveness than about who has the paperwork. And I had it all, stacked and waiting, the weight of years compressed into envelopes. The wedding was now 3 days away, and I knew the trap would spring before vows were spoken, because timing is everything, and justice isn't justice unless it interrupts the show. And Friday arrived like a storm with no sky, only tension pressing down on every breath. The courthouse mediation room lit too brightly, walls the color of old paper, the air filled with the scratch of pens and the shuffle of binders. Claire sat across from me, flawless in her curated white blazer, Ethan beside her with a jaw tight enough to crack glass, their lawyer whispering furiously while Tony stacked the blue jar's contents, one packet at a time onto the table, each receipt landing like a drumbeat. Maya, the planner, dabbed her eyes, terrified of her reputation collapsing under the weight of contracts she hadn't read carefully. I didn't speak at first. Silence was my weapon. I just watched Claire's face stiffen as Tony read the clause aloud. Failure to acknowledge third-party payment within 10 days constitutes breach. One line, a forgotten checkbox, and the structure of her wedding wavered like a tower missing its keystone. Ethan muttered, "This is ridiculous," but the mediator raised a hand and said, "The documentation is clear." My chest filled with something colder than triumph, inevitability. They tried to offer settlement. Partial refund, a seat at the wedding, a photo op to restore public harmony. I refused. "I don't want a seat at a table built on lies," I said, voice steady, and for the first time Claire's eyes dropped. The mediator's notes became official record, and the vendors knew restitution had to flow my way or their contracts would collapse. When mediation ended, Ethan shoved his chair back, whispering something sharp into Claire's ear. She flinched. I almost pitied them. Almost. Outside, the air smelled of rain-soaked concrete. I lit a cigarette I didn't finish, hands shaking not from fear but from the release of pressure. Tony clasped my shoulder. "It's done. They'll fold." But I wasn't done. Because poetic justice needed to be public, not just legal. That night, I uploaded a single photo to the same neighborhood group that had carried the earlier posts. The blue jar on my table, receipts fanned out like a crown, the napkin where Claire had once scribbled, "You're a saint, Em." My caption was 12 words. This is what family loyalty looked like before they rewrote history. The post went viral in hours, shared across platforms, headlines spinning it into a parable about betrayal, money, and blood. People who'd never heard of Akron debated me like I was a character on a TV show. Claire and Ethan posted glossy engagement photos, trying to drown the noise, but the comments filled with screenshots and receipts, strangers dissecting their hypocrisy. Then the twist arrived. One vendor, furious at unpaid invoices, leaked their group chat where Claire admitted she had cut me out because Mark makes me look small in front of Ethan. He'll always be the one who saves me. That message detonated everything. Screenshots flew across platforms. Podcasters picked it up. By morning, Ethan's employer announced he was on leave pending review. Public perception doesn't just sting, it dismantles. Claire called me at 2 a.m., her voice ragged. "Why are you doing this? You've destroyed us." I almost answered with rage, but instead I gave her the truth. You destroyed yourself the moment you chose erasure over gratitude. Then I hung up. The wedding never happened. Vendors pulled out, the venue canceled, guests withdrew invitations, and what should have been Claire's perfect day dissolved into refund notices and unanswered calls. I didn't go on a luxury trip out of spite. I went because I'd promised Emma a summer she'd never forget. We boarded a plane to Maui the same day Claire should have walked down the aisle, and as the ocean spread out beneath us, Emma gripped my hand and whispered, "You didn't let them erase you?" I looked out at the endless blue jar safe back home on the shelf, and realized revenge wasn't about breaking them. It was about proving I had been real all along. The scar remained, yes, but so did the lesson. Family isn't who eats at your table. It's who keeps your name when it costs them. And in America, where people confuse silence with weakness, sometimes the only way to survive is to keep the receipt. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.